Very happy to have Rina with us today in Calcutta. You may have attended some of our Zoom meetings. We had some during the COVID times, and we had a very large audience actually. We had over 2,000, 3,000 audience across the world who listened to those wonderful Zoom things, and where Rina showed a lot of her works as well. And today she is physically in Calcutta. So welcome to Kolkata.
Thank you.
And she'll of course tell us why she's here. And I'll just briefly introduce you. I'm sure many of you already know about her. So she was born in Kolkata, and as a child, her parents migrated, and through UK, where they lived for a few years, they finally settled in the USA. So she's actually a product of American culture. Hopefully. And so she was educated there, and the first degree after school that she got was in engineering, surprisingly. And it was after her engineering degree that she decided to go into fine arts, and she went into Yale University, where she finished her art studies. And her works subsequently dealt with migration, ethnicity, race, and various American diasporic histories. And the works are very layered, they're very beautifully crafted. Being an engineer, I think she tells a little bit about that. I personally feel that being an engineer, she had an edge over a lot of artists because she could do magic. She does magic with her works. The way she installs them, the way she creates them is absolutely phenomenal, amazing, absolutely. So Rina's works are with she works with various multimedia resources and uses textiles, historical and globally sourced objects, and remnants to create her sculptures and installations. Her drawings and paintings are often inspired by Chinese and Indian miniatures. So she has a lot of Asia. Actually, Rina is an artist of the world. Her worldview must be that, a very global worldview. And that is what she conveys through her artworks, and she'll tell more about it today. So, Rina, I start off with, of course, a very brief introduction, but today I think what we'd love to know from you is, what are your ideas about art and why are you in Calcutta?
Well, Raki, thank you for the introduction. So I arrived a few days ago for a symposium, a kind of think tank between colleagues that are scattered throughout different universities in the West and here in India. And it came out of a conversation I started to have with Romita Ray, who is a faculty member at Syracuse University. And we're doing a project together, a solo museum project. Romita and I went to school at Yale together. She was perhaps the only South Asian person I knew in all of Yale University at that time. And I think we've encountered each other upon one conversation socially. And after about 25 years of trying to stay in touch with her as an art historian, we've come to this intersection where I'm visiting Kolkata. Probably this is my second time visiting in my lifetime. I'm 60 years old, so I came once when I was 21 with my mother to sell some land in Dhaka, because my mother's from Dhaka. And again, in my 40s, early 40s, and now here in my 60s. But I also came here to meet Raki. And I've known Raki over many, many years. I can't say how many, countless. And it's a relationship that has come out of curiosity, not only just for Kolkata, but also individuals that have brought me here. And I think that's most important in coming to get to know a place. You don't come to a place just to know the geography or what's beautiful in the architecture or the museums or the art in the museums, but really it's about having relationships with people and continuing to learn about who they are and what motivates them. All my travels in different places for my work or for travel itself has been about that exploration. And one of the things that it allows me to do, which is very selfish, is to learn about who you are and what the boundaries are that allow you to feel like yourself in the world and to find a home in the rest of the world where you don't live. And so those things become points of conversation in my artwork, and they're revisited, and the source for my artwork is sometimes those relationships, what I've learned from them. Rocky, of course, is also very familiar with the whole world and has traveled all her life. And so she affords an experience of what it means to be here in the presence of Kolkata, but also in her own vision of what it means to work with art. And while I make art, Rocky lives with art as well in her own capacity. So I'm hoping our conversation will create a new understanding of what it means to be working with art.
I'll tell you an encounter, the first encounter I had. This was, I think, 2003 at the Whitney Biennale. Yes, there was the Whitney Biennale going on, and we entered the first hall. And as we enter, my husband was also with me, and we confront this gigantic but beautifully crafted glass with glass tubes, a huge installation on the walls. And what fascinated at that stage, I didn't know who the artist was. What fascinated was the artwork. What is this? I mean, this is almost like it had that ethereal quality. And I thought it was a beautiful thing. But as I moved closer, and as I gazed through all the layers of glass, I realized that it was also a very painful story that I was encountering. And that was based on a wonderful idea, I would say, where she spoke about disease and migration and race. All that came in this beautiful artwork. There were traces of blood, there were traces of, it's unimaginable. It was so beautiful, at the same time, it was full of pathos and it was full of pain. But you never felt repelled by it. You were drawn to it. And that is what drew me. And Rina Banerjee at that stage was an unknown commodity, unknown person as far as I was concerned. I didn't hear about it. Then we peered on the label, and there was this Rina Banerjee right here. Is she from India? Where is she from? And we hadn't heard about her. And that's when we started prying and we started finding out, and we discovered you. So that's the story of our first encounter.
That's important to know.
Yes. So that is what art does, actually. You discover people, you discover artists, and you discover the feelings and the things that join and bring us together. And that is what I think art is all about. And that is what the first encounter was all about. And I got to know you, yes.
And that was, during that time, it was probably one of maybe my third sculpture. And when you're a young artist, you don't really know what art is about, why you're making the art. You have to discover that as well. It's an experience. And at that time, it was a very unique moment in American art because the 2000 biennial, the Whitney Biennial, was going through a transformation. And the transformation allowed it to drop its name from being the Whitney Museum of American Art to the Whitney Museum, which it is now in a different location. And what marked that time was a kind of openness to a variety of artists that would represent for them the world. The world was becoming global, and that reach was going to be represented in the art that would be displayed in this big group show, which is what a biennial is. And there had to be a way in which you could accommodate the variety of voices that one hoped for in seeing an exhibition of that scale. There are 4 floors of this modern building, and in its history, it's always been one curator who is in-house, a salaried person with board of trustees, whose ambition is to represent what is American art. And in the year 2000, the ambition had changed to open itself up to the world. 5 curators would be selected through the museum's ambition that would be scattered throughout the United States. And for the first time, female curators would be among the 5. So 3 of the curators were women. Never before was that allowed. One of the curators was a Black woman. Never before has that happened. And in that promise was the opportunity for what was then the first South Asian artist, who was from India. And I remember when I was asked to make this work, I was supposed to have a space that was 10 by 10 feet on the wall to make a work. And within 2 weeks, I think the 5 curators in several meetings had decided that my space would be expanded to 33 feet in height and 25 feet in width. And I only had 2 weeks. So I'm coming back to Rocky's story about the glass tubes, which was a quick solution to making the piece larger. And what better way to make a piece larger than to think about migration? I hadn't titled the sculpture that I was making for months. And upon making it and expanding it, these tubes, which were really thinking about fluid, if all our mobility could be released without passports, without boundaries, what would be the fears that we would have in making this release possible? And that would be, the idea of disease. And interestingly, and unfortunately, we've come back to those ideas of what constrains us, constrains our movement from completely being fluid. And at that time, we were having the AIDS epidemic, which was primarily a fear among gay communities, but also a fear in Africa and India that was getting to be at an epidemic levels. And I remember there was also a kind of challenge of the West Nile virus. There was talk about how every disease had a country outside of US that would pinpoint the problem areas in the world, and where you couldn't travel, could travel. But finally, what made me call that piece Infectious Migrations was this idea that we always wanted to believe that disease came out of another place, never our own home. So that was really my first, I would say, closely political piece that I've ever thought I would do.
So now coming to the political thing, since you are also a teacher of art, you also teach art, and you teach theory at some stage. Your works do have a very strong underpinning of theory. So tell us a little bit, because this is one point which confuses a lot of our young artists. because you're straddling between these two areas, one of theory and the other of the practice of art, making of art. And what is the fine line between these, the practice and the theory?
Well, I think when you're making art, you really clear the deck, so to speak, so that you're really close, intimate with your thoughts. And it's a very physical experience to make sculpture or painting. And you want to be involved in that kind of meditative space. But what you allow yourself to experience also is what theory is about. It's about real human experiences. And you can never forget that all that is intellectual in any manner is also about the human heart and the human mind. And it can't be divorced from that. What allows us to talk in the language of theory is to consider larger viewpoints where you can enter into a more complex understanding of that experience, which seems very visceral and real. That you enter into a dialogue that is large enough to include all kinds of ways of thinking, so you can come back to the work and talk about the more basic things like how is it made, what color it is, what compositions, why is it beautiful, why is it rejecting beauty, all these things. And really to be able to think in complex ways allows us to not to make it complicated because it will be hard for you to understand, but to make it complicated so that more voices can participate. And I think when I'm teaching, theory, it's always is a kind of puzzlement to the audience that are the students, that theory is about rejecting the audience itself from entering the conversation. But really, it's about allowing more people to enter, not less. It's not an elitist, exclusive space. It is a space that allows more, and growth and transformation into the future generations. And that is the challenge of theory. Can you let go of your personal physical bodies themselves to allow to think about other things,
But would you think that art should chase theory, or should theory chase art?
I don't know if one chases anything or we always go in circles. I feel when we're thinking about what art should be about, you always think in this kind of predetermined way that you're making progress. When you're in your 30s, you desire to make progress because you are maturing, your mind is maturing, your body's maturing. And you believe in progress. And then when you come into your 40s and 50s and now, my 60s, you realize there's only circles within circles. And so this idea that you could be entering into a more higher place or a lower place, I don't think that really exists. But to have depth in your work means that you have to do that circle over and over again. And that allows you to feel growth. Now, if that growth means progress, maybe, I'm not so sure.
But as an artist, what is happening in the modern world is, mind you, it always happened. Even Michelangelo had to get money, and he had to be paid by somebody. That money was always a big thing. After all, art is a practice and it is a profession. So money directly, indirectly comes into the play. But in modern times, an artist has to invest in a lot of promotion. And this is something that a lot of our young artists are not aware of because it's not taught in the art colleges. How do you, as you enter into the public domain of your profession, how do you conduct yourself? What do you do? How do you approach people? How do you connect with people? Now, these are things that you had earlier also spoken about, and you always have emphasized on this connection. So tell them a little bit about that. I mean, as an artist, the idea of connecting with the world, not just with the world in general, with people, but also with establishment, art institutions, galleries, the entire gamut of the infrastructure of art. And one has to be connected and well conversant with these various avenues. So that is one area, maybe our art students might want to know about.
Sure. I mean, I think it's very important to realize that all that is contained in the world is not about institutions and marking your life, measuring your life by the success of conquering an institution in the way that we might hear, I had a solo in this museum and now I've done this biennial. I think it's dangerous to see yourself as that conqueror. And so I think it's very relevant, especially in art, to realize that the work that you make, your creative impulse, whether you're an artist or not an artist, is really about connecting with people and the kind of reward you get. Now, coming back to making money, you must connect with people in order to motivate other people to support you, whether it's psychological, social, it's your family, it's the institution. All these things are made of people. You don't really see it because there are buildings that you have to go through and physical spaces, and there's often class-oriented obstructions that don't allow the socialization that we all deserve to have access to. So whether it is this ideological space of East versus West or rich versus poor, we all have to find a way to make ourselves known in the world as individuals. And one of the ways in which we do that is choosing a career, a role, a job, and this becomes an interface in which we enter into our socialization with the rest of the world. And globalization is about our socialization into the whole world versus just, the city or the village or the country. We deserve and should be a participant in all of it. And all of it is really human culture. And in terms of selling yourself, there's nothing to sell. We've already bought into the idea that human culture is what we recognize as valuable. There is no other place to go. And so whether it's tourism here, who's going to come and visit Kolkata, who's going to go visit New York City, we're going there to see the culture of these places. It's not really the institutions, even though we mark it in maybe a map. I'm going to go to New York and I'm going to visit this museum and I'm going to go to this library or go see this bridge. We're really looking at human culture when we go tour a different place, and we're looking at our own culture. And I think in that there is some comfort in knowing that your PR work to promote your visibility and to be a success in the world is about really believing yourself as valuable in the world, and especially for women in the world. that you are very valuable in the world. And the world has not learned about who you are yet. It's been so hidden. And it's a very open world in the future because there are so many spaces left empty, waiting for you to make your presence known. So I think especially for women who are in the world, who are trying to share who they are, the institutions are all about who you are, and they want to know you. If you go with this impression that everyone's been waiting for me all day, I must leave the house now, you'll find yourself in the right spirit of accepting not only yourself, but the way the world really is, that you may not be able to see through all the layers of what we call culture and society, particularly.
Now, since you are also a teacher, now do you have any idea how modern art institutions or institutions, the role of art in the various institutions? Most universities now in India also have a visual arts faculty, and the well-known visual art institutions. Do you see some massive change coming on, especially regarding women, the role of women, the interception of women, collection, universities, most of them have, especially in your country, they have museums. Very few museums collect art by women. Very few, I mean, the percentage of art by women is minuscule. And
Yeah.
so, do you think institutions are now reckoning this and they are changing their curriculum and they are changing the emphasis and, regarding this? Do you find any major
Yeah.
change happening in the art student?
I don't think the institutions are doing anything. I think the thing that is happening are individual people are beginning to push the institutions to create a system that acknowledges women, and it acknowledges the representation of people of different generations as well, because there is a lack of availability of or visibility of people who are of various generation. And what I mean by that is that in my youth, I remember a lot of exhibitions would be clearly an exhibition of what appeared to be a variety of artists or artworks, but they were all of the same generation. And what I'm seeing now happen in a very conscientious way is people's awareness that they don't want to be in a room full of only people of their same age. When you think about it, we go through the school system in classrooms where everyone is our same age. All our friends are about the same age. The people we socialize with outside of our family are the same age. I do think it's unhealthy to have exhibitions where everyone is male, everyone is the same age, everyone is the same cultural background. And I think it's unhealthy because it doesn't create a conversation. And it's really these kinds of gaps in difference that allows us to try and fill the gap. Well, what's in between these two things? And so I'm seeing exhibitions where older artists who have been more or less ignored are in play. Your career is not over because you're 50, for example. It goes on. And that younger people don't have to wait and wait and wait to be shown and wait till they're 40 and 50 to be shown. I think that is something is a challenge. And I think that deaccession of permanent collections that have allowed a dominant role of male artists and artists who've made work a certain style or way, a dominant style or way, for example, abstraction being dominant. There's a possibility of more individual work. We don't have to say, oh, this is the style of the era, and if you don't do this style, then you can't participate in art history. So those kinds of recipes or formulas for creating the future are being examined. I wouldn't say abandoned, but examined. And I think the more we examine, the more likely we'll come to thinking about what does quality mean? And are we following these ideas of really looking at what moves us and not what really sends us to a space of comfort and acceptance? I think we were talking about earlier about fitting in versus, trying to belong. And I like to think about those two ideas. You don't necessarily have to fit in to belong. And that allows a lot more movement in who we can become.
So I think we've discussed a little bit about, we've got a fair outline. Now we'd like to have all of you sort of intervene, please. Rita, would you like to ask anything?
I was just asking Rina at what age she had migrated to America. She said that from the age of 5, she has been living in the West. And when a child goes to a foreign country and starts living there from the age of 5, one would expect her to be integrated with that culture. But Rina's work shows this conflict of cultures. That I would say it's a kind of colonial experience, and there is this very sensitive way of looking at different cultures coming together, and there is a sense of conflict. So I was wondering, although you have lived in the West for so many years, you have been able to draw in the experiences that Easterners, Asians have felt about the West. Afro-Asians, I should say. Would you agree with that? I have felt that, what Afro-Asians have felt about the West and the dominance of the West and how there is a sense of conflict. I have felt that your work reflects that. And I'm quite amazed in the sense that you have been living there for so many years, and still that experience is very alive in your work.
Yes, it is. That's interesting so if I may just visit what you were suggesting, to be sure, you're saying that you're surprised that I would feel such conflicts. That you would associate those conflicts or turbulence with Afro-Americans and yeah. So, of course, I think there is all kinds of conflicts and there's a lot of turmoil when confronting culture. There is no acceptance of a singular culture of any kind. Culture itself is really a provocative and difficult place because it allows an expression that might challenge ideological places of all kinds. And I think all cultures are not welcome in a national body, a country. And so I would also say that any culture having any visibility or identity is submerged or suppressed in order for stability to be felt. And so I think whether it's African or Asian almost doesn't matter, even though we think it does. That I think when one speaks through culture, there's a lot of space to create visibility of oneself that comes in conflict with what a government wants, what their agenda may be. And I think in the best of worlds, culture doesn't have an agenda. It has its people. And the very ground you walk in does not produce culture. People produce culture. And it doesn't matter where they go, how they get there, and how they live. But I think that's what the conflict is, that we want to believe that these boundaries of culture must be maintained, fixed, without movement, so that people can be controlled in what they say and what they do and what they call their culture has to be also directed by a central thought process or central kind of power. And to decentralize that kind of power means to invite very remote cultures first as the antagonist or the foe, the enemy, is that which is the furthest way, like Asia, like Africa. And so consequentially, I think, Asia and Africa or China or India or Russia, these places that are considered remote become the subject of visibility when thinking that conflicts are a bay or conflicts are a problem for these cultures, that they can't assimilate, adapt to what? There is no original true culture in any one place, whether it's India or Africa or the Philippines or the smallest island in the Pacific Ocean, which is what I'm reading about right now. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. So if you entertain the idea that there are conflicts, and I'm saying there are conflicts, but if you entertain that's the problem, the cultures, then you're basically giving permission to create a war between cultures, which is, after that war is over, there would be no culture at all as the only significant result of peace. So I don't think that's a very good direction by which to talk about the conversation of conflict. So I would say I would refuse that, because I think primarily only thing we really do have is this language we call culture that wants to remain alive and unfold its own complexity at all points and make shifts which don't allow us to essentialize these cultures in any way and makes it impossible to represent them fully. So I think that is what makes making art so pressing and relevant to contemporary culture, but also it's almost a vehicle in which we find ourselves exploring who we are as individuals with or without culture, if one can imagine. We all exist as individuals, as wonderful souls that are in this room that need to be enjoyed, shared, and loved. And we do that with culture, through culture, as a means, but it's certainly not the ends either.
Another interesting thing, I'm just digressing a little bit about Rina's work, is when Rina's titles are almost literary. They come from literature. She's almost creating literature. What do you have to say about, you write a lot? So we have some people from, the literary faculties. And so maybe there's a big interface between literature and your artwork. I mean, you use writing in a big way. All your titles, they're almost like a poem. Some of our titles are almost a two-line poem. So how do you do, I mean, you're interested in language as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started painting and making sculpture, there was a very dominant culture of titling paintings untitled. It was almost fashionable to do so. And I'm concerned about that, to give up your voice. I'm encouraging artists to really think about the text around their work, to have control over it. I'm also coming from a generation where if you found an article in the newspaper or in a book about your work, you probably were not even interviewed and asked the question. Someone who called themselves a critic or an art historian came to realize certain things about your work without ever having spoken to you. And now that we're in a more communicative media culture and people have access through the internet, that's almost impossible. Or I should say it's more the culture that if someone's writing an article about your work, they're probably going to email you and you're going to have back and forth conversations. You might have a Zoom meeting. Now that we've had COVID, we have a lot of Zoom. And you get to know people easily. So we live in a different time now. And so there is a possibility of recovering that lost voice of the artist. I'm encouraging all kinds of people of different media, whether it's film or painting, to talk about their work. And the only way I could do it in my generation was through that title. There was a lot of censorship. Even with my title at that Whitney Biennial, I had condensed it to 2 words, infectious migrations, that one sculpture. But there was a lot of censorship about what my title could be or what my work could be about. I wasn't allowed to talk about the work being intimate with the experience of AIDS. People were embarrassed by it. They just didn't want to talk about it. So I think that the title was something that we still had the freedom to create and to share. They had to put it next to the painting or work, what your title is, no matter what. There was no room for censorship. And so I began to extend it. I began to enjoy it. I don't really see myself as a writer at all or a poet. But I think that my titles now, as they've evolved, have become quite large and bulky. And I am an artist that likes a lot of stuff in my work and invite a lot of layers. So they talk about the content of the work, but also they talk about who I am at that moment in time. And I think that is a precious thing that you can share with an audience, because it is text. It's a language that might be more accessible if the audience is not an artist, they're not a painter, and they're not a sculptor, and they look at your sculpture and want to know, what is this about? And no one is interested in this particular South Asian in New York City who's making work. No one's writing about that work. So you have to write about your work through that title and communicate to your audience. So they can read that title and say, okay, I don't know what this work is about, but I know English language. And so these words, send me in this direction.
Gives you a clue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone wants to, yeah?
What do you think about the emergence of new technologies like artificial intelligence affecting the art world, art imaging? And do you think that it's a very exciting area that's going to come up in the future?
Well, it's hard for me to judge if it's exciting or not if I'm not participating in it, But I remember when there was a time when people thought, when video art was coming up, they thought painting was dead. That was the term that was being used at that juncture. And of course, painting is not dead. Nothing really dies. Everything just keeps being reborn. And so I think it's very exciting that there are different ways of making art or challenging what we think is art. Any kind of medium that is new is probably not as new as we think it is, but it's interesting that we think there are new things. So I don't know if I would say that I have a very specific reaction to it as being exciting or not exciting. Yeah.
So, hi, my name is Niladri Chatterjee and I teach literature at university. So, Raki was probably referring a little bit to me as well. Two questions. First question is, thank you so much for connecting theory to the bodily, to the visceral, because that is something which we academics unfortunately tend not to acknowledge. So theory therefore becomes something that is purely cerebral. And we somehow manage to distance it from the body and from the emotion. So I personally, whenever I teach theory, and I have to do that quite a lot, mostly feminist theory, I constantly try to tell the students that, please take it personally. This has to be about you. I would be interested to learn from you, what techniques do you find most useful in order to make theory more personal to the students, to make it much more available to them? What are your takes?
Yeah. Well, definitely when I'm making a sculpture where it's clear the process, because it's a long-term project often. You're picking things, objects, which sometimes I use found objects, sometimes textiles, sometimes they would be considered materials. In either case, you're picking things that you're attracted to. You have emotional connections, but also that are connected to ideas, in our language. And those ideas have conflicts culturally. They mean different things in different places and in different contexts. And so you have to really think deeply about why that is. And so you come across theory. And you come across conflicts in that language that reveal whether those differences have meaning or no meaning, that sends you in those directions. I think that when you're making work that is potent, that has kind of both cerebral and emotional and is invested in the dominant language, but also kind of challenges it. It creates, a reaction from you as the first audience that, interprets the work. When I'm making the work, I like to have all those ingredients. I don't know what it will mean until, maybe years later time always makes a difference because your mind is growing with whatever the current problematics of your time is. And so I feel like theory is always there. It's never not present. It's like saying, the human mind doesn't exist in this idea, or politics isn't present here in this painting, but is in this painting. All of it exists all the time. So I don't think you have to ask theory to present itself. And I think that the more things you can talk about in your work, that you're open to talking about, the more you will gain from the experience you have as an artist and as an audience to other artists' work. I think that that's just one of many things that can be talked about. Yeah.
If I may, my second question is about the wall text, because you were talking quite a lot about it. So how invested are you in the wall text? For example, if you have a solo show, so to what extent do you get to invest in the wall text? Who writes it? What words are chosen?
Oh, whether I'm invested in it or?
Yeah, like so if you have a solo show, there's going to be a
The
wall text. that is
curatorial
going to-
notes and all.
So do you decide who writes it? On what basis do you write your own wall text? So
It depends. I just had a retrospective, and that was a big part of the retrospective was to consider what the wall text would suggest. And I think what is exciting about young curators, when I say young, I mean 30s and 40s, is that they're very excited about the wall text. And it is something where they want to, express what they think about not only my work, but their role as curators. And I think the collaboration that takes place between curator and artist is much more important now than it did, where in the past, it was much more hierarchical. And as I alluded to before, there was a level of censorship of the curator upon the artist or the art historian upon the artist that isn't so much now. And so there's room enough, because it is very boring if the work is a solo show or a retrospective is just about my work. It would be a very boring experience for me. So to make me excited about having a museum show is about working with the curator and finding out how the curator thinks to learn what her project is, and what she sees in the world, in my work. And then the collaboration allows us, in the end result, to walk away from each other seeing more of the world than we could see all by ourselves.
Another thing, Rina, we were chatting about before this discussion, and you mentioned about ambition, the word ambition for artists, and how you connote that. Would you like to talk a little bit about what you mean by ambition?
Well, I think the word ambition was always like a very scary word for me when I was young, in my 20s, because I thought it meant to create something that was so large that was impossible. And with time, I think by the time I was in my 30s and 40s, I thought I can arrive at an ambition if I work really, really hard and give up a lot of things that would make me happy, kind of like a monk. And then later on, I realized that ambition was not just to be driven. It wasn't enough to be driven, that you have to really live your life completely and fully in order to arrive at the ambition. So it's, for me, ambition is not like my ambition is to, be the best movie star or make the most beautiful building as an architect, but it's more about what does it mean to live your life in the role that you have chosen? And I think ambition requires courage, and it requires faith in humanity. And I think the most ambitious thing you can do is to have faith in humanity. And that's not easy to do. That's a struggle always, as you know, you face all the kind of hurdles of even wanting humanity to survive in the world. And so that ambition comes into being an artist in the sense that you want to continue sharing. You know, after a while, you know, you've had enough shows and you think, do I really need another show? Why do I want another show? You always wake up thinking, what would the next show be about? You know, and so you need more than the ambition of having a career or having success. You know, it's about this ambition for humanity after a while. And you arrive at that place, which is so large that you would never have managed to even think about in your 20s, that you're now thinking about in your 60s. What's your ambition for all of humanity? Yeah, that surprised me, I think, about ambition.
How you build up your sculpture, the process you take much longer time to complete your work. And as you said, if I'm not mistaken, so how do you do your collections, and do you keep on collecting all the materials, or as it comes to your mind, you have to hunt them out? Yeah, that is the way. I think it's a question for any artist.
Yeah.
When it's in the process that you are building.
Yeah.
So how you give shape to it finally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the point.
Yeah. Well, you have to have a lot of fun being an artist. It's really important.
Chance to play your role.
Yeah. You have to give yourself enough space to have fun and to enjoy yourself and to be playful and curious about yourself in the world, you know. And I think that I like finding things, foraging for things. I see I basically grew up in cities. I went to college in cities. And it was always an adventure because the city has this idea of having everything inside it and layered and hidden. And there's treasures. And there's the feeling of, when I pick things for my work, of this thing is a treasure for me, but no one else sees its beauty. So I feel very intimate with the object, that it is magic in itself and alive because it's magical, but no one else sees it. And I always have this feeling that I'm going to bring it to my studio and make something of it. And then everyone will see how beautiful you are. And sometimes that happens. And you create something that has all these things that by themselves were not so alive, not so present, or they were objects that were identified so clearly marked. You know, for example, a feather is just a feather from a bird. But can it be all these other things within the scope of a sculpture? And the idea of a single sculpture is that it can transform all the things in the world, all the objects, into one sculpture, like the earth. And that's kind of strange experience conceptually, that we can do that. And I think sculpture for me is about that has all these components, ingredients, And then in the end, you see it as one thing. That to me, and everyone else also who is human sees it, oh, there's that one sculpture, but it's really made of all these things.
Would you call it assemblage or collage or both?
Both. I mean, I think those words have specific histories in the way they've been developed. I don't know if it always applies to the way I work. And I'm sure there'll be new vocabulary that allows you to think of it in other ways. Yeah. But there is this aspect of separation that allows us to believe in the whole conceptually. How do we decide that this room is a separate room from the other room, functionally, conceptually? And I think that interests me in making objects come together when they're next to each other in a collage or in an assembly. And then how do we measure when something becomes whole?
To follow from what you just said, now the more common in art is what I term as opinionated art. Yeah, where you are either pro this or anti that, and the storytelling isn't there. How does that happen, and why is that happening? Where it has become so opinionated and so kind of, maybe you could say, pseudo political, like, or trying to be political. But I feel that about, or is it just immature art?
So I'm not sure if, so you're asking me to comment on that, correct?
What makes art to be like a story, and why are artists now more expressing their opinions about things instead of making the viewer reflect, or their opinions are somewhere silent? But the thing to reflect on the questions is more. But here now, there are no questions. There's just an opinion.
Yeah. Well, the whole idea of sharing something that is what you make in the studio is to bring it into a place, an exhibition, where it becomes something else. You let go of your opinions, hopefully. But most of the time, I think, I don't know, I don't feel like I have opinions that are complete. And so I go to the studio to find out how I think, what I think, and why I think, what other people think. I think artists are given the right to express their opinions on subjects that were never allowed before. So you may feel that it is kind of dramatic, immature, simple when they do. And I think all those things are okay, because I think one has to be a little clumsy first before they become adept at what they do. There hasn't been that much time allowed to us to be free to express what we want to without some sort of censorship. It's the first step is to get used to not having censorship before you can have freedom to do something sophisticated, mature, that isn't simplistic. And so I think it's important for us to be generous and yet critical, very visibly critical about what we see, and not to be afraid of being critical, But I think, my experience with exhibiting and with interacting with academics and art historians and critics is that we all like when something is opinionated enough where it provokes us to say something.
But where the artist is in the background.
Mm-hmm.
The issues, that is in the foreground. But nowadays, at least I feel that it's the reverse.
That the artist is in the background.
It's me saying this.
Right. So you're saying the subject matter of what the artist chooses is foremost, and the art is not there.
That's right, yes.
I think that art is not always about just art. That's part of what we have to be open to. Sometimes it's about other things. And I think one of the pleasures I have of being an artist is knowing that almost anyone, you don't have to go to school to get a degree to say you're an artist. If you enjoy the pleasure and the freedom of that scope of who becomes an artist and what the artist is there for, then you have to be tolerant and resilient to players, to participants who are there for all different kinds of reasons. And I think unlike, saying, okay, I want to be a lawyer and this person didn't get a degree and doesn't have a law practice, so they're not a lawyer. All those kind of markers of achievement are in some ways in which to censor who can be a lawyer. And we don't have that in art, supposedly. Of course we do. And so it allows for a lot more flexibility and more, there's a price to pay for having that transformative space where everyone can possibly or theoretically enter to make it what it is. Someone might make something tomorrow who is from a village, or it may be my grandmother, or it may be a donkey who makes art, or it may be, a Nobel Prize scientist who says, I'm going to be an artist today. And it allows you to take seriously that when they say it's art, you have to agree. You agree in this language of culture that it is art. Let me consider it being art. And you might come to a conclusion that it's not art, and that's valid. But when you make a whole area of thinking that is that loose, you're going to have to be resilient.
So I'm Nobuja, and I work with audiovisual medium, and I teach film studies here. So I was listening to you, looking at the images or the reproduction of your work, and also reading about it. And I'm really touched by the materiality of the objects that you create, the artwork. So I was wondering, especially since you are based in USA, and whether your work becomes a way of also speaking to the Native American artists or the Afro-American artists, but particularly because material like the cloth is so important in the Afro art histories, in the contemporary times or since the longest time. So I was also, because in many of the sites you're described as a artist of South Asian origin, or you're bringing into your experiences into that space of new conversations. So I was thinking whether you, through your work, enter into a conversation with the Native American artists or the Afro-American artists, especially the material that you use to create the sculpture or the art.
Do I think about Native American artists?
No, do you enter into a conversation through your work? Like, as artists, as writers, we do locate ourselves within a realm of work, other artists. We enter into conversations, people, artists from the past, or contemporary artists, not necessarily for groups or agendas, but in some ways we connect, there are these dots that help us think through. Yeah. And since you want so much, your concern is with the material object, and about, let's say, cloth or found material. And I've seen works of both Native American artists, but also Afro-American artists who use especially cloth, as a way of expression of our histories, cultures. So I was thinking that this set of possibilities of conversation between bringing our own histories and cultures and politics within this realm of practice.
Yeah, I mean, I do think about the various cultures and how they perceive of the cloth and think of the cloth. I think that marks probably the human experience very much so, because we are one of the animals that do wear clothing. And the politics of the body is about that wearing or not wearing and selecting. Yeah, and we're aware of that. And I think that when you're making sculpture, you're also concerned with the sensory experience of touching an object and what that surface is. The cloth, I think, has, in my experience, when I've gone to museums, I've always been interested in clothing and furniture and objects that were ancient. And so in experiencing the ancient in Western Museum, you don't really experience Europe as an ancient culture. You experience Africa, South Africa, North Africa, the West Africa, India, the Aztecs, South America, Native Americans, the Pacific. The world is full of ancients, and then there are the Europeans. It's almost as if only the ancients would just disappear, then we would have the real modern human beings. So that language, that symbolic gesture, which is learned out of Western museums, created for me an interest in the materials that maybe oceanic cultures use: feathers, wood, seashells. Could these things then be used in contemporary culture in a way that is sophisticated looking, looks modern, looks Western, looks European? In some sense, it challenges the idea that the materials themselves are locked into the ancient past, and that the ancients have really disappeared ideologically. They're not present as part of the dialogue of history. And so to claim a space that is much more porous so the ancients can come to the foreground and become visible is one step towards creating a cultural space that is much more horizon, that has a larger horizon line. And I think that it's a critique of Western museums, the way they present artwork, of course, and the way that students learn what it means to be an artist. So if you want to learn to be an artist as a live human being, you should not look at what the ancients do, therefore not look at what Asia does, not look at what Native American, you should look at European work. So that's the message that is being drawn out for you. And, artists, young artists do that for a time being. And so there is a taboo around these other materials because of that. And, even though painting was always done on canvas, we rarely talk about the fact that it's on fabric, on cloth. And I think those things have been, clearly talked about or in discussion, in discourse, since the 60s or even earlier, about the cloth. And a lot of feminist work is about that.
Well, I was just asking that, I think that having lived in Canada myself for some time, I found that the Indians living there kind of hang on to their culture, They're kind of more conservative than the Indians out here sometimes, I find. So I was wondering that if you were exposed to the Indian traditions and whether that had any effect on your art.
I'm not sure if I heard.
No, like Amrita Shergill, she was, sort of Indo-Hungarian, I suppose. Yeah. And then sort of how she came to India and kind of discovered herself, and it's kind of reflected in her art. So, do you think that your Indian culture, Bengali culture, as you said, textile, which in Bengal has a rich tradition of textile, has it in any way influenced you or inspired you?
Yeah, I'm very sure that my interest in textiles come out of growing up Indian and in a family that is excited about textile, is knowledgeable. Yeah, definitely, but not exclusively. And so, experiencing, growing up in Queens in New York, I used to go to the garment district in Manhattan with my mom and see textiles from all over the world in a way that I don't think my mother grew up seeing the world in that context. She saw a large world here in between Bangladesh and Kolkata of textiles that unified all of India, different parts of India with different textiles. And she knew that language as a very complex language. And in ways that I don't know if it's lost, but recognizing different parts of the world through the cloth allows you to realize not only that it is this precious, complicated thing, textile, but also the technology and science that go behind.
And in Asia itself, mind you, each region in textile, it had its own sort of distinct identity. Like what we create in Bengal or what we create in Maharashtra or South, it's a different meaning. That's quite fascinating.
Yeah. So I was familiar with that, not knowledgeable, but familiar. But I think also because, my family was invested in engineering and chemistry, I was also very aware of technology and chemistry that goes behind a lot of these traditions that are either lost or not talked about.
Absolutely. When you go to these remote villages and you see them weaving in the dark, it's amazing how they create these designs.
Yeah. And also about the chemistry of the ingredients of dyes and, you know, that we call recipes.
So, Rina, anything else that you would like to convey? Otherwise, we just close, and thank you so much.
Thank
were
you.
Really, really,
Thank you
very
for your
kind because
patience.
she's come on this, they're going to have this workshop and this session that's going to start very soon. And this is like a period of rest for them because you've flown all the way, the jet lag. And in spite of it all, you've come here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for
It's wonderful having you.
coming today.